Hello, thank you for being willing to allow me to virtually present today. I'm so sorry for not being there in person. I want to thank my colleagues for helping lead this symposium in my absence and their patience with my travel delays. I'm going to be presenting research today that I conducted along with Catherine Mimnaugh, Karina Van Riper, Heidi Marie Laurent, and Stephen Lavelle. And the title of our talk is Can Simulated Nature Support Health? Comparing short, single doses of 360-degree nature videos in virtual reality with the outdoors. Not everyone has access to natural environments. In fact, this is why I became interested in simulations of nature in general. So, for example, in America, nearly 2/3 of us live in cities, and many do not have access to safe green spaces. Americans spend over 1 million days every 2 years in hospitals, many of which have windows looking out onto gray space, not onto green space. Over 9 million adults in the United States and Europe live in assisted care facilities that have limited nearby nature. And approximately 40 million Americans are physically disabled and may struggle to go outdoors. Even people who have access to nature do not always feel comfortable going outdoors or have sufficient time to do so. In all these circumstances, we believe warrant the development of technologies that facilitate more frequent interactions with the natural world, including in indoor settings. One inexpensive and convenient way to provide nature is with virtual reality. These new all-in-one headsets, such as what you see here, allow you to experience nature from the convenience of your backpack. You can these cases. This is the new Oculus Quest, and the case is about this big. Let me see if I can show it here. Back up a little bit. It can easily fit in your backpack, and here is this headset here. And these cost $200 to $400 United States, and you can get all sorts of beautiful imagery from all over the world that are quite immersive. If you haven't experienced this, I highly encourage you to do it. I was hoping to demo it at the conference today. So let me just see if I can play one here. This is courtesy of our colleague David Hopman from Enviro VR. This is a beach, I believe, in Costa Rica, and when you move your head, it tracks your head, and it'll rotate the image one way or the other, and you can look up, and you can look down. And when you have on noise-canceling headphones, it's quite immersive. Our lab has begun also playing around with infusing scents and playing back the speed and direction of the wind to create that haptic feedback as well. At least some of the benefits of nature exposure can be obtained through, for example, indoor environments where you only have the visual and auditory exposure. So when you see and hear nature, there are differences in your nervous system activation as well as your cognitive processes and also activity in your prefrontal cortex, for example, ruminative brooding. And this will relate to changes in affect, as well as your stress, as well as your cognitive functioning. And these are explained, by attention restoration theory, stress reduction theory. I did want to call out my colleague Hector Alvarez and I have come up with a scanning for threats theory, which expands the stress reduction theory to not just evolutionary preferences toward nature, but also personal familiarity and personal experience. So these 360 therapeutic nature videos certainly do not exist in a vacuum. In fact, my colleagues and I recently conducted a systematic review of all the papers that have used simulations of nature as a way to measure short-term health outcomes. And there were over 150 since really starting in the 1960s and 70s. There are many, many studies, and they use all different types of simulations, such as the ones that can be seen here. And the latest standalone headsets is only a part of this long-standing legacy. And yet the literature is not clear on whether simulations of nature serve as substitutes for real nature outdoors. In still or moving images studies, for example, ones with televisions, there's been some suggestion that there's been no reported difference in energy or stress levels after exposure to outdoor nature versus virtual nature. However, when other studies, such as Peter Kahn and others, when they actually measure physiological markers, there does seem to be a difference in benefit of outdoor nature exposure. Yet VR, virtual reality, may provide stronger beneficial effects because it's more ecologically valid, it's more immersive, and this reflects the extent to which someone perceives themselves enveloped by, included in, or interacting with an environment. Simulations are also just more realistic, which provide greater therapeutic benefits in general, and are more likely to elicit feelings of awe, and which relate certainly to attention restoration theory than less immersive technologies. At least 3 studies we've identified have directly compared 360-degree nature videos with corresponding nature outdoors. So, for example, Calgary et al. 2018 and Frontiers, they found a marked difference, but the participants, when they were in VR, experienced motion sickness because they were actually, as you can see in this image here, they were traveling along a path, and even though they were trying to replay the motion on a treadmill, it's extremely difficult to get the motion exactly synced up with the movement that the individual is seeing. And so their results were somewhat confounded by this what's called cyber sickness. Yin et al. 2019 in the journal Indoor Air out of Jack Spangler's lab at Harvard, they were comparing virtual nature with physical nature, but they were actually looking at indoor environments, you can see here, which is directly relevant to our symposium. Yet indoor environments, plants in indoor environments are not going to confer all the exposure pathways that outdoor environments might have, such as aromatic and auditory natural elements. And so there's an opportunity to directly compare an outdoor setting. Now, most recently, Ciccori and Gaglioli, I apologize for butchering your names. I'm looking forward. I'm actually going to have a conversation with Alice shortly. They also compared these, but they didn't have a control group. So they had virtual and outdoor nature, but with no control. And so we don't know to what extent their findings merely represented exposure to an environment in general versus a natural environment. Ultimately, there's opportunities for further understanding whether simulations of nature serve as substitutes, particularly when you're looking at confounding factors that are somewhat understudied in the past literature, such as past experiences, time in nature, virtual reality use, and then also familiarity and landscape preferences. This table is from that systematic review that I mentioned that's in review, where we're looking at the number of studies that controlled for these different factors. And you can see that relatively few studies have controlled for these very individual experiential and preferential factors. So in the current study, subjects were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. Outdoor subjects, right here, sat in a foldable chair, while indoor subjects here just stared at a blank wall. And then there was a third treatment where indoor subjects experienced the exact same forest that was seen outdoors, but in virtual reality with noise-canceling headphones, which you can see right here. Now, all 3 of these subjects consisted of a 6-minute sitting and a 6-minute walking phase. And we included the walking phase because these outdoor subjects had to walk to get to this site from the research lab. And so we actually had the indoor subjects also walk indoors before and after this sitting segment to reduce any confounding due to physical activity. Now, the measures we looked at affect, both positive and negative, using PANIS, and we also looked at perceived restoredness after the session. In addition, we measured physiological response using skin conductivity And this was throughout the entire experiment. We were looking at changes in effective response. We had an initial sample of 190 participants from our online pre-screening survey. These were undergraduate students at the University of Illinois that we recruited. But some potential participants were excluded if they had a diagnosed mood disorder, took prescription medication, had bad hearing or sight, or other attributes that might interfere with an immersive virtual experience. There were 98 eligible subjects that volunteered, but due to equipment failure and some data loss, data were only available for 89 participants, and for the skin conductance physiological data, there were some errors in the biosensor that we used, and so we had 65 participants for that data set. Our sample consisted of 43 males and 39 females, relatively even split, with a mean age of 20 years old. They were predominantly non-Hispanic white or Asian. They had moderate levels of disgust sensitivity. So this is a neat measure from Rob Bixler that hasn't been used that much in psychological literature that I've seen. So this is the extent to which someone gets grossed out by things like mud and bugs, which is very relevant to the difference between a restorative virtual environment where you wouldn't experience these things necessarily, and a physical environment where you necessarily would. Engagement with beauty scale, which references the extent to which someone, when they think about beauty, will think about the natural world, as opposed to, for example, a great work of art. And then, as I mentioned, these experiential confounders, frequency with nature. So, over half of our participants had been to a nature-based park in the past year, but they had been there less than 10 times in the last year. So, moderate levels of use. Relatively few people had experienced virtual reality, and we also report our baseline levels of mood here. What we ended up doing is we ran 3 models for linear regression using the baseline level as a confounder and the post-treatment levels for example, positive effect and negative effect as the outcome variables. And we use stepwise regression to first look at just how basic socio-demographic factors influence the model, and then adding in the treatment, and then adding in all the individual and experiential factors. So what you're seeing here in the final model, Model 3, we have binary variables for a VR treatment or an outdoor treatment, and the comparison group is this control treatment, as I mentioned, that had no nature experience. And we're actually finding that positive effect, post-condition positive effect, was higher for both the VR and the outdoor in comparison to the control. In other words, both virtual and outdoor nature were having a stronger impact on positive effect, positive mood levels than the control. And interestingly, the only other significant predictor in this model, besides the baseline levels, was the extent to which someone thought about beauty when they thought about nature. We found very similar results. I'm not going to show them here for restorativeness. So again, virtual nature and outdoor nature had significantly higher perceived restorativeness as measured by the 11-item perceived restorativeness scale, PRS, in comparison to this control group. And we did not find any significant differences in negative affect, which is quite interesting, between these 3 conditions. T-test for before versus after levels, we only find increases in positive effect for outdoor mood. We did not find an increase in positive affect for the VR treatment. Our physiological indicator for mood, again measured with skin conductivity to evaluate electrodermal activity, showed that for the 2 nature conditions, there was tended to be a higher skin conductance level, as well as a more steadily increasing slope over time. Now, increased skin conductivity skin conductivity can represent positive or negative arousal. And so this really has to be seen within the light of our survey responses to determine the valence. Now, in follow-up analyses with outdoors as the comparison condition, which is the figure on the right here, we found no differences in the trajectories between the two nature conditions. Generally, these findings suggest that increasing physiological arousal during the nature exposure occurred, and it occurred to a lesser extent in the virtual condition. The summary results, I'm going to try to quickly go through. I know I'm running out of time. We did find that 6 minutes of nature exposure and these all-in-one VR headsets produce similar effects as 6 minutes of outdoor nature exposure. Both were superior to sitting indoors with no nature exposure. However, and both of them resulted in increasing physiological arousal. And so these short, single, isolated doses of 360-degree nature may provide an emotionally beneficial alternative. However, as I mentioned, there does seem to be a stronger effect for outdoor nature than virtual nature. This really extends past studies on virtual nature and its impact on mood. There's been several studies that are finding effects where a positive effect remained constant over the course of exposure while a negative effect decreased. In other words, we're finding benefits for negative effects rather than for positive effects per se. This might have to do with participants becoming bored or disengaged while viewing simulations of nature, which are incompatible with positive effect. There were certainly strengths and limitations of this study. We did look at a novel technology. This is quite different than other VR studies, which have been going on for decades, because this is mobile technology that can really be used on a broad scale in the comfort of an indoor setting. And we also adjusted for these confounders, which relate to differences between an outdoor nature and an indoor nature exposure. But we did have a predominantly young, healthy, white or Asian sample. And so this might not be generalizable to, for example, older adults or clinical populations. But it certainly can serve as a springboard for future research. So for example, we have a clinical trial at Michigan State where patients are using the headset while they're waiting for their doctors to come in, after the nurse has taken their vitals, which is often sort of a dead time, a time where someone might check their phone and get on a social media site. Perhaps this would be a more restorative experience when they're in this enclosed indoor setting. We have another study where we're actually sending students home that have elevated levels of anxiety and depression and asking them to watch restorative videos every day as a meditative experience, and then looking at both the underlying mechanism on why we think this might improve their symptoms as well as their actual clinical symptom severity. So given my time, I'm going to skip a couple sections here. I did want to mention that this is a larger body of research that we're analyzing in a meta-analysis, and this is just a highlight of a manuscript we hope to get out soon. So this is a random effects model, a forest plot, and you can see that the effect size for the difference in changes in positive effect before versus after exposure to a simulated versus a physical or a real nature exposure is quite large. So Hedges G, an effect size estimator, is almost 1.0, which is quite large. And so we continue to be interested in this and look forward to people reaching out with questions or interest in collaboration on this line of research. Thank you for your patience with this virtual presentation.